But this is really important, and I really do appreciate your holding this hearing, Mr. Chairman. This is critical, and I thank all of you for being here today. Since 2000, more than 370,000 service members have received a first-time diagnosis of traumatic brain injury. It is one of the most common and least understood injuries that service members experience. And thanks to the work that you and others have done, we now understand that exposure to blast pressure can result in an impact-related concussion, where the brain is damaged because it bangs around inside the skull. But we are also now coming to understand that the blast pressure wave can also cause harm by damaging the brain at the subcellular level. And while most people think of TBI as being the result of exposure to an IED explosion on the battlefield, we're now learning that it is not the only or even the most common source of blast exposure for service members. So I was very glad to get an amendment into this year's defense bill that requires the Pentagon to begin a longitudinal study of the blast exposure that our service members experience on the battlefield and when firing larger weapons during training. Can I just ask you, Dr. Dodick, can you explain why tracking blast exposure over time is essential to helping us get a handle on this problem?
Well, I think a blast exposure traumatic brain injury is in some ways different than the kind of brain injury that one might experience on a football field or on an ice hockey rink. There's an acoustic wave, as I mentioned earlier, that travels through the brain at a very high velocity that at a microstructural level damages the tissues and disrupts the connections between cells, in addition to, as you say, rattling the brain around inside of its skull. So there are multiple mechanisms of injury that I think are distinct and unique, and I know that there are some research labs in the country looking specifically at the cellular level, at the cellular level, the injury cascades that are set in motion after an acoustic blast like that. So I do think the injury is different, and I think the work is ongoing right now to see whether or not, at the end of the day, does it really matter? Are the same cascades still set in motion? Is the initial impact injury from a blunt force to the head versus a blast injury, is that the same?
Right.
And how different are they? There's no question in my mind, as you allude to, that up until recently, we've always said concussion is a functional brain injury from which 90% of individuals recover fully. Well, that may not be the case, because even when you do an MRI scan, which is certainly more sophisticated and can see the brain at a finer detail than a CT scan, you may not see the injury until you peer at a microscopic level with special types of MRIs, and then you see these fiber tracts that are just completely disrupted, like you took a pair of scissors to them, that you don't see on a routine MRI scan. So I agree with you completely. There's a lot happening at a cellular level, at a microstructural level that we can't pick up on routine clinical imaging. We definitely need more imaging research, and we definitely need more basic research to understand whether or not these two injuries, the blunt force versus the acoustic blast, is similar in the damage to the brain that occurs as a result of them.
Well, that's very helpful, and it looks like we're going to get this one passed into law. I also want to note, though, my amendment requires that the Pentagon consider the feasibility of a blast exposure log, analogous to a service member's jump log for airborne operations. So let me ask about that one. Could data collection like this help ensure that blast exposure is fully documented so that service members get appropriate care if they later develop post-concussive symptoms? Dr. Miles, could I ask you to weigh in on that?
Certainly, and I think that the idea behind the helmet sensor and mouthpiece sensor data that we're researching to determine, can we get a sense of how many blows and at what force those blows are occurring, that same technology could certainly be applied to our service members. Dr. Dodick had mentioned earlier the cumulative effect of subconcussive blows, and that same effect, whether that's because of blast injuries from using firearms or explosions in the field, although concussive at the time, when added up, can lead to these same symptoms. And so I think the idea behind keeping track of the amount of force that the brain sees over a given time is a very good concept and may lead to a threshold identified that when a service member reaches that, you pull them out of the their activity or whatever they're doing that's leading to those exposures.
Well, thank you, Dr. Miles. That's a powerfully important point. You know, we all know that traumatic brain injury can have devastating lifelong consequences for our service members and our veterans, and I'm grateful for the work you're doing in this area. I hope you will let us know if there is more we can do. I have a question about protective equipment, but I'm already over my time. Is that all right, Mr. Chairman? Is that all right? Thank you. Good. So I want to go to another area here. The Pentagon is at the forefront of research into equipment that protects the lives of our soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines. For example, I am very proud of the cutting-edge research that the Natick Army Soldier Systems Center in Massachusetts is doing. Everything from improving body armor to preventing stress injuries. Natick is also at the cutting edge of helmet technology, and the research has shown that different helmet designs and shapes can change the way that blast pressure impacts the brain. But right now, most of the military helmets that we give to deploying soldiers are designed principally just to protect against bullets and other blunt injuries rather than blast injuries. So, Dr. Miles or Dr. Dodick, whoever would like to do this, what does the research tell us about the types of helmet modifications that might reduce pressure transmitted to the brain in a blast? Who would like to go?
Yeah.
Dr. Miles?
So I can speak to that in the hockey helmet and football helmet. I can't speak to it in the military helmet. And so if that's okay.
Well, let me just ask, Dr. Dodick, would you like to speak to it in the military context?
Yeah, I don't know a lot about the actual
impact. There's a lot of discussion on whether or not football helmets are able to be designed to decrease concussive risk. And again, the injuries may not be the same, but it seems like a very important area of research for the military. If that can be designed and we can reduce the forces that the brain is seeing inside the skull, there's a great likelihood that you'll.
I would say, Senator Warren, that there's no evidence to date that any technology, helmet or otherwise, has actually been able to reduce the incidence of concussion. Because as you said at very early on, it's that movement of the brain within the skull. It's almost like, I make the analogy, it's like an egg. It's like a yolk inside of an egg, and you shake it, you can break the yolk, but the egg looks fine. Helmets have done a very good job at preventing skull fractures and preventing major catastrophic intracranial bleeding, for example. But there's no evidence yet they've been able to reduce the incidence of concussion.
Well, my view on this is that we owe it to our service members, anyone who is put in harm's way, to have the best possible equipment. And the best possible equipment starts with research, to figure out what works and what doesn't work. So I hope this is an area where we are doing more and trying to determine what we can do to best protect those who are in the field fighting for us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate, again, your having us
Thank you,
here.
Senator Warren.